There are 3 books I believe every business owner should have. Gary Vaynerchuk's The Thank You Economy, Napoleon Hill's The Law of Success, and the book this man wrote, Daniel Pink. The book is titled When: The Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing. Dan, thank you for joining me on TYC today, man. I am so stoked to have you.
My pleasure, Ken. Thanks for having me, and thanks for putting me in such elite company.
I appreciate that. When I reached out to you on LinkedIn, I had a one of those moments where I just felt compelled to reach out to an author. By the way, there are only 2 authors in this world that I've ever reached out to, and one of them is a mentor of mine, Gary Vee, who I mentioned in the open. The other is you. And this book, When, has changed so much of the way my day functions as a CEO, as a business owner. And to me, it made such an impact that I have now given it to all of my team members. I have gifted it to at least 20 people, have recommended it to probably 30 more. And so I want to start with something.
I owe you some royalties, it sounds like.
Yes, absolutely. I should get a kick for this, but I won't. You know, there are a ton of books. If you go into any bookstore, if you go online, there are a ton of books that are how-tos, right? How to improve, how to do this. You wrote a book not about how, but about when. Tell me why.
It's a great question. Partly because a book like that didn't exist, and in particular, that was a book that I myself wanted to read. Because like all of us, I like your listeners, like you, I mean, I'm an entrepreneur of sorts. I have a tiny little operation here, 2 employees. I've been doing this for 20 years. And every day I make all kinds of decisions about when to do stuff. I'm a writer. So when in the day should I write? When should I take a break? When should I start a project? When should I abandon a project that's not working? When should I exercise? And I was making these decisions in a very half-assed way, and that frustrated me. And so I looked around and said, there's got to be some guidance on this. To my surprise, that guidance didn't exist. And so I started doing some research and realized that there's an enormous amount of science out there on this question. It's complicated science in part because it's spread over many, many disciplines. But I felt that if I went wide enough and deep enough into this research, I could write a book that would be helpful to me. And to people like you.
Yeah, the book was incredibly helpful and written in a way that made it incredibly digestible. By the way, for those of you who are just joining the podcast, it's TYC. I've got Dan Pink with me, the author of When. The book is available on Amazon, BN.com, iBooks. I mean, it's everywhere. It's such a great book. When I reached out to you, how I came to know about this book isn't because I was unfamiliar with you, actually. I knew who you were because I had read To Sell is Human, which is an earlier book that you had written. But I was in Atlanta on a weekend business trip visiting a buddy of mine, Dobbin Buck from Get You Wired. It's an agency. And we were sitting there against his trout stream talking about books and time hacking and life hacking. And he said, oh, Spanky, he calls me by my nickname. He goes, Spanky, you've got to read this book by Dan Pink. I'm like, what's the book? And so when somebody recommends a book, I take it very seriously. I wrote it down and immediately got the book. And I started digging into it because for me, as a 50-plus-year-old guy, a father of 5 kids, and Dan, you know what this is like. We all have busy lives. You've got, 3 kids, right? 2 in college. I've got 2 in college, 1 in high school, 2 in grade school. Like, it's crazy.
Oh, man.
And so I was tired, and I was starting to think, gosh, am I sick? Is something wrong with me? I went to the doctor, started getting checked out because I thought, it must be some, 50-year-old testosterone thing. And when I started reading the book, it changed everything about my thought process in the structure of my day. And so I want to dig a little bit into what you have found most beneficial about time hacking your life, and what, of all of the information and tips you've shared in this book, what have been the biggest ahas for you?
In terms of how I applied it to my own
Absolutely.
life? Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. So it's an interesting question because I think that this is the 6th book that I've written, And this one actually has had a deeper impact on my day-to-day than the other 5. And I can give you all kinds of examples of this. Let me give you, I'll just give you a few off the top of my head. So one of the things that I write about is research showing how does our mood and our performance change over the course of an individual day. And what we know from a whole raft of research, again, in multiple fields, fields from sociology to economics to social psychology to chronobiology to anesthesiology and endocrinology, what we know is that our brain power doesn't remain static over the course of a day. Now, this is really important. Right? I think people have an intuitive sense of this, but I really want to underscore this. Our cognitive abilities don't remain static over the course of a day.
Right.
They change. Right. And that's really important. And they change in material ways so that the difference between the daily high point and the daily low point, it can be significant. And what's also true is that the best time to do something in a day depends on what you're doing. And when you unpack all this research, what it shows is that we tend to move through the day in 3 stages: a peak, a trough, a recovery. Most of us, about 80% of us, move through the day in that order: peak early, trough in the middle, recovery later in the day. The 20% of us who are night owl, I'm not a night owl, but the 20% of us who have what's called an evening chronotype in chronobiology, who are night owls, who naturally wake up late, go to sleep late, they're much more complicated. They hit their peak much later in the day. Anyway, so once I realized that, okay, I have a very ordinary kind of, I have like probably the most common chronotype. I realized like, okay, in my peak is in the morning. And what does it mean to be in the peak? The peak means that you're more vigilant. Vigilance means you're able to bat away distractions. And so for me, there's no question that, and the research tells us that we should be doing our analytic work during the peak. Analytic work is work that requires heads down, focus, attention, energy, and analyzing data, going over the steps of a strategy, and writing. All of the people in your audience, and you as well, Ken, who write, know that the moment you sit down to write, when your butt hits the seat, your fingers hit the keyboard. At that moment, the whole universe begins looking for ways to distract you.
And it finds them every time.
But you want to go in, you want to battle that by being at your most vigilant, which it changes over the course of a day. So for me, what I did is I became much more rigid in my daily schedule, so that on writing days, I come into my office and I don't do anything except for write. I don't bring my phone in the office with me. I give myself a word count. And because I know I have this moment, and it's fleeting. It's maybe 3 hours, 4 hours, where I'm at my most vigilant. And that's when I'm going to be best able to do that heads down focused work. And so I do that. And what I don't do anymore, which I did for years, which is a total freaking waste of time, is that the first thing I would do when I come into my office would be answer email. And so
Guilty.
What I would do is I would gobble up, an hour of that peak period doing that kind of crap. So I changed that. So that's one thing how this book has changed me. I was someone also. I'll give you 3 examples. So another example would be in this book I have a chapter on brakes, and the main point of that is that we've woefully undersold brakes. We have woefully undersold brakes. Brakes are much more important than we realize, and we know a lot about what kinds of brakes we take. And so I was someone who always would say, okay, brakes are for wimps. Brakes are for amateurs. Professionals don't take breaks.
I'm going to muscle through this crap no matter what.
No matter what, because that's the way to get more stuff done, and also shows what a great human being I am.
It's all about work ethic, Dan, right? It's work ethic.
Absolutely. It's puritanical. Even people with the last name Moskowitz have that puritanical hook, even though no direct relation to the Puritans, right? We all believe that, right? Total nonsense. All right, what the research tells us is that we should be taking more breaks and we should be taking certain kinds of breaks. So now instead of powering through, I take fairly regular breaks. And so all kinds of things, I won't go, we can talk more about it, but even things like the episodic nature of our lives. So the research on timing is not only about how we architect our days, it's also about understanding to some extent the temporal aspects of almost everything that we do. So think about, I know you do a lot of work with advertisers and whatnot, and a lot of advertising in general is project-based, all right? And projects have beginnings, projects have middles, projects have ends. And so much of our life is episodic in that way. And what the research tells us is that beginnings have one effect on our behavior, midpoints have another effect on our behavior, and endings have another effect on our behavior. And so once you're aware of that, those effects are no longer, you're no longer passive to those effects. You can make them visible and you can do something about it.
Well, it's fascinating to me. I have been in the creative industry my entire life. I started writing ads at the age of 12 in New York City in my bedroom, and I was the nerdy kid that made commercials, not mixtapes of music. And so I've been in this business since I was 12. So, 40 years now. And what's fascinating to me is that until I read this book, and the book is titled When, and if you haven't heard of the book or gotten the book, it's The Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing. Phenomenal book. The book opened my eyes to something that I didn't even realize in myself. I was trying to be creative at the wrong time of day for me. And I when I started reading it, I looked back at my history and I thought, wow, I think my most creative times are like 2 o'clock to 5 o'clock, maybe 3 o'clock. And I'm like, why is that? Well, now I know it's in my rebound period. And that is the time I should be doing my creative. During my trough period, which is that, okay, so Dan, could we talk about the different periods in the day? Because you've put all the work into this. Explain the difference between the 3 times and give an example of each if you can.
Sure. So what we talk, so we tend to move through the day in 3 stages. If you look at studies of mood and performance and whatnot, so peak, trough, recovery. And as I mentioned, some of it gets nuanced because some of it's affected, as I mentioned, by chronotype. About 15% of us are very strong morning people, larks. About 20% of us, as I mentioned, are very strong evening people, owls. About 2/3 of us are in the middle. A sort of an overly simplified but useful way to think about it is owls and non-owls, okay? And so if you're a non-owl, all right, you're sort of in the middle or a lark, it goes peak, trough, recovery. Peak early in the day, trough in the middle, recovery later in the day. As I mentioned, what we know about the peak is that that's when we're most vigilant. And that's when we should be doing our heads down focus work.
So we call...
Owls, later in the day, yeah.
We call that the heavy lifting part of my day. So, my assistant has been great at keeping me out of emails at that time of day. She doesn't let me see emails until I'm into the afternoon because she knows now.
Perfect.
And we have a saying in our office because of trough. And so when people make mistakes in our office or we're brain dead and the words can't come out, we literally have a picture of a seal laying on its belly asleep, and it says because of trough. And I've taken it a step further, Dan. I have these periods called megatroughs, and a megatroph looks something like this. Man. I just cannot function. So I've encouraged people to take naps because it's vital. You made a discovery about naps that I made by accident a while back. I like you did not like taking naps. I thought they were kind of a waste, and I would wake up groggy. And you discovered the same thing, but you discovered you were napping wrong. What's the right way to nap?
Yeah, again, what the research, there's a lot of research on napping too. And what it tells us is that naps in general are pretty good for us. They can restore our mental acuity, boost our mood a little bit. But the ideal nap is remarkably short, shorter than I would have expected. It's between 10 and 20 minutes long. Beyond that, beyond 20 minutes, if you nap for less than 10 minutes, you don't get much of an effect. If you nap for longer than 20 minutes, you begin to get what's called sleep inertia, which is that feeling that you're describing, that kind of groggy, boggy feeling. And then, but the ideal nap is between 10 and 20 minutes long. And that ends up being a nap where you get the restorative benefits of the nap without any of that groggy feeling that comes from sleep inertia and napping too long.
Okay, so go ahead.
Well, yeah, no, and I would have never thought that a nap that length would be effective, but it actually is. And that's my own experience, but also verified by a decent amount of research. There's a lot of research on things like on people with very, very demanding jobs, and naps in very, very demanding jobs. There's a famous study of air traffic controllers and the effect of napping on their acuity. Other studies of first responders and their ability to perform at a higher level after a nap. There's some interesting research on things like people's memory improving after a nap and so forth.
So there's a hack that you add to the napping, and you've framed it as you take nappuccinos. And
yeah.
So what is that exactly, and why?
Yeah, well, that's just a kind of a turbo rocket boosted form of the short nap that I'm saying. And that what you do for that one is you have a cup of coffee before your nap, and then you go. I mean, here's what I do. I will go. I'm talking to you from my office right now, and there's a chair literally right there that has a little footstool, and so I'll sit in that literally like right there. I will sit in that chair, and I will set my phone timer for 25 minutes, countdown timer for 25 minutes. And right before that, I will have a cup of coffee. I won't enjoy it. I'll brew myself a cup of coffee, and I'll just plunk a bunch of ice cubes. I won't sip it. I'll just
chug.
Plunk ice cubes in and just chug it totally. And then I'll close my eyes, hit the timer for 25 minutes, close my eyes. I will put on noise canceling headphones and close my eyes. And at this point, with some practice, I can usually fall asleep in pretty quickly, like let's say 9 minutes. All right. So I fall asleep on average in 9 minutes. The alarm goes off in 25 minutes. So that gives me a 16-minute nap. That's right within that 10 to 20 minute window. And so I've got the right length nap, but remember that cup of coffee that I had, it takes about 25 minutes for caffeine to enter our bloodstream. So at that moment I'm waking up, I get a second boost of the caffeine hitting my bloodstream. And so that's and again, there's research on this too, but it's known colloquially as you said, as a nappuccino.
Yeah.
It's basically the scientifically ideal nap.
Yeah, MJ, my assistant, will say to me at certain times of the day, she's like, "Do you need a nappuccino right now?" Because everyone on my team has read the book. I've made it almost mandatory now that you must read the book if you're going to work at Ad Zombies.
Cool.
So one of the things that I've employed are restorative brakes, and I want to talk a little bit about them, but they're somewhat counterintuitive to people. To get up in the middle of a task and walk away from what you're doing. And I've broken it up into very deliberate time blocks. So for example, I will work for 50 minutes, and then I will get up and I will take a walk around the atrium downstairs in our building, and I'll muscle through. But the first few times I did that, I rushed to finish the sentence or to finish what I was doing. Now I stop mid-sentence, close the document, close whatever I'm doing, and I walk away from it completely. I want to talk a little bit about that, but I want to specifically get into how does a person who, like I own my own company, I have a team, and I can really encourage them to do these things that are going to help them be more productive, healthier, happier. How does John Q. Public, right? How does somebody who's working in a company, works for a boss, how do they hack their days better when they've got to work under the time constraints of their business and the business owner that they work for?
Yeah, it's a tough issue, and so I think the best strategy is to have an honest conversation with your boss about this, but frame it with her or him in terms of what's in it for them, basically. So you want you to do your best, and this comes up a lot with people who are again, we're coming back to chronotypes here for a moment. It comes back to people who are owls. Again, 20% of the population for whom a 8 a.m. staff meeting is torture. And so you don't really, that's a really bad idea to bring evening chronotypes to an 8 a.m. staff meeting.
Right.
It's about something quantitative, tough-minded, strategic. And so, I think you have a conversation with your boss about that. And I think bosses can be somewhat enlightened about these kinds of things. I think there's a growing looseness. If you look about the explosion, it's just amazing to me, of remote work, of more results-oriented workplaces and so forth. So I think you can have that conversation. The other thing is just to, start small and work the margins. And so even things like, if you're in a job where you have a little bit of discretion about when you can take a break, your break isn't mandated by a, floor manager or something like that. Just put into your schedule a 15-minute walk break outside every afternoon, and that can be really helpful. Try to do simple things like don't answer your email right away in the morning if you're more of a lark, or in the middle and have to do heads down work. right away. So, talk to your boss and put it in terms of their self-interest, and then also just start small and work the margins on these things. It's harder to do. I mean, I work for myself, and so I have a lot of control over my schedule, but I don't have full control every single time. And so, so just being intentional about, knowing, having a sense of where you are and being intentional about what you're doing and trying to, do something that is good even if it's not perfect.
Yeah, it's funny. The time that things occur in my life now is so critical that I've become, I think, a little bit rigid, but you know what? It makes a huge difference. I have an upcoming conference in April where I'm keynoting, and they asked me if I have a preference of time, and I thought, are you kidding me? And so I get to be the opening keynote, right? Because that's when my energy is highest in the morning. I get to be the opening keynote, but then I've got another conference that I'm speaking at where I'm on stage at 2:30 in the afternoon. Oh, yeah, that's bad. So how do you hack your time and because you can't change your biorhythm, right? You can't change your chronotype. How do you hack for moments like that where you have to shift gears and you have to be in that state of high energy? How do you do that in a down period, a trough, or a restorative time?
Yeah, let's talk about let's just talk about it at the specific instance that you gave, Ken. So so giving a talk at 2:30 is suboptimal. Let's put it that way. So what can you do to make it slightly better? From your point of, if I'm doing this at 2:30, which is a suboptimal time generally for these kinds of things. First of all, I would take a 5-minute or 10-minute walk outside before you do this. So if you can, at 2:15, take a 5-minute, maybe 10-minute walk outside. I would absolutely do that if I were you. Second, you might want to have a little coffee, a little caffeine in your system, maybe 20 minutes in advance. So that'll give you sort of restore a little bit of energy on you. All right. So another thing that you can do is, let's say, I don't know how complicated the presentation is, but I would go up there with, at the very least, a checklist, perhaps even more comprehensive notes. So you're not relying entirely on your memory for this. I think you're better off in this case. I mean, I'm a fan of people having notes anyway. I think it shows respect for the audience that you planned and whatnot. But having a checklist, make sure there are 3 key things that I have to get across in this presentation. Go up there, put on the podium your checklist of the 3 things you need to get across, and then make sure you peer at it periodically to make sure you actually get that done. The other thing that I would do is I would consider for the audience themselves. Remember, your crowd is probably at the trough too. You can do a couple of things, and you've seen this before. I used to think it was cheesy. Now I'm a fan of it. You can have the audience at the beginning stand up and take a stretch break right before you talk. You could also, in the middle of, let's say your presentation is 45 minutes long, change the rhythm a little bit by maybe having the audience actually do something rather than just passively listen somewhere in between, to change the rhythm and give them a little bit of a break. And so all those things are gonna, none of these are like perfect silver bullets.
Sure.
But the collective force of them are gonna make things a little bit better at that suboptimal time.
Yeah, one of the things that I learned from Tony Robbins was I have this high energy music I call it's a get in state playlist that helps my brain get into that high energy state. And
cool.
That allows me to amp up. That's why Tony, before he goes on stage, gets on his little trampoline. He's bringing his energy up, right? So he can deliver to the room. Now, you mentioned checklists, and I thought checklists were super fascinating. Here in my office, we talk about checklists constantly, and when I was learning to fly, one of the things that I discovered was the value of checklists. If you're handing off control to the other pilot or the co-pilot, you turn to that pilot, you say, your plane, my plane, your plane, your plane, right? So there's everyone knows at every step of the way what's going on. This should be happening throughout people's lives because you miss things when you're in those suboptimal times, right? And when I'm talking about that, let me, so that the audience really can connect to this, we all have those times of day where you just feel like, oh, I can't muscle through, I'm tired, and you go, well, I just ate lunch, it's lunch. It actually may not be the lunch, right? Yesterday I had a very light lunch. I had soup, and yet at 1:30 it was Trough City. And it doesn't matter because your body naturally goes through these peaks and valleys throughout the day, and it's not like you can change that. But something in the book really caught my attention, and I'm so grateful that I didn't read it before my dad, who is now 78, had open heart surgery. And that is, and you know where I'm going with this, Dan, his surgery got pushed back a few hours. And all of a sudden, his surgery, which was supposed to be late morning, wound up being about 3:30 in the afternoon, which scared me because I figured the surgeon was going to be tired. But then I read your book, and I was like, oh my God, I'm lucky he didn't die. Talk to me about this.
Yeah, I mean, healthcare is a great example. There's a lot of research on this about how performance changes over the course of a day. And one of the things that we see is if you look at incidences of hand washing in hospitals in the afternoon goes way down as a cause of hospital-acquired infections. You look at doctors prescribing unnecessary antibiotics, higher in afternoon appointments than in morning appointments. Look at the prescribing of opioids, higher in afternoon appointments than in morning appointments. You look at anesthesia errors, 4 times more likely at 3 p.m. than at 9 a.m. And so, you know, I have a rule. I actually just had to deal with this on a, it's an interesting sort of minor case study. I have to go to a doctor's appointment, and it was a hard doctor to get an appointment with, and the only opening she had was at 3:15 on a Friday afternoon, and I'm like, and I say, okay, wait a second, that's not great. Do you have anything in the morning the next week? No, our next morning appointment is until March, and so I was like, oh God, okay, so I'm doing this 3:15 appointment, and this is not for 2 weeks, and I'm already thinking, okay, what can I do? So I'm thinking, okay, I have to go in with a checklist of questions for this particular doctor. I have to try to make sure that she's paying attention, that she's actually answering my questions and so forth. So I'm going to go in this kind of heightened state. It's probably good hygiene anyway for a doctor's visit, but I'm going in super intentional and at a heightened state because the only appointment I could get was at like this horrible 3:15 on a Friday afternoon.
Not only do more medical mistakes occur in the afternoon during those trough periods, but if you're up for parole, if you're in front of a judge, if you're in court for something, sentences don't necessarily go your way in the afternoon.
Well, I mean, there's a really interesting piece of research on jury decision making where they gave jurors, experimental setting, they gave these participants who were jurors. They said, here's a set of facts. Half the jurors got the set of facts and the defendant's name. It was a criminal case. Here's a criminal case. You're the jurors. We're going to give you this set of facts to deliberate on, and then another group we give the same set of facts to. The only difference is that in one case, for half the participants, the defendant's name is Robert Garner. For the other half, the defendant's name is Roberto Garcia. So same set of facts, just a different name for the defendant. When the jurors deliberated in the morning, they rendered the same verdict for Garner and Garcia. However, when a different set of jurors deliberated in the afternoon, they were more likely to acquit Garner and convict Garcia on the same set of facts. That's terrifying.
That is terrifying.
Yeah. So, I mean, generally, the general life advice here, Ken, is if you can avoid it, don't go to the hospital anytime and don't become a criminal defendant.
Exactly. Those are two things I want to avoid at all costs.
I'm dead serious about those. Like if you could, don't go to the hospital if you can possibly avoid it at all, and don't become a criminal defendant if you can possibly avoid it at all, because the degree of uncertainty, unfairness, chaos, screwed upness in both of those settings is monumental. In the afternoon, it's just even worse.
Yeah, and you as the consumer could become the victim, right?
Totally.
Because you have no control over it. The book is called When by Daniel Pink. If you've not gotten it, go out and get it. It's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Dan, I just want to say thank you so much for this amazing book, which has truly changed the way I run my business, the way I work with my team, the way I function. I don't even drink coffee now when I wake up. I drink water in the morning, and I don't have my first cup for 90 minutes. And you know what?
Smart move.
It's those little things, because as someone who, like you travel, you speak, you write, you have to get as much juice out of every squeeze. And to hack, and look, if you're listening to this or watching this, you want to get the most out of every moment of your busy day, whether you work for someone or are building your own empire. And knowing when to do things is critical. And it has made such a huge impact in my business. So thank you very much for this book.
Well, thanks a lot for saying that, Ken. I think you've kept me in the writing business for maybe another week.
Cool. What's the next book going to be?
Oh, I'm trying to work that out right now. Trying to figure that out now. Writing a book, as you and your listeners, many of you and your listeners know, is a giant pain in the neck. So you got to find something that you really, really care about, something you're willing to talk about, think about for years and years and years and years and years. So the bar is very, very high.
The bar is.
I'm trying to figure that out.
Well, Dan, thank you for your time today. I greatly appreciate it, and I hope our paths cross again.
Yes. Thanks, Ken. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.